You are in the middle of an ordinary moment. Nothing dramatic is happening. Maybe you are walking alone. Maybe you are in the shower. Maybe you are lying down trying to sleep. And then a thought appears. Something small. Maybe a conversation from hours ago. Maybe something you said, or something you could have said. Suddenly, the mind begins to replay the same scenario. You review the sentence. You reorganize the response. You imagine another way you could have acted. Then another, and another. A few minutes pass, and you realize you are still there, thinking about the same thing. Maybe you have experienced this many times, the feeling that the mind cannot simply let things pass. It comes back, reviews, analyzes, searches for something that might have gone unnoticed, and then that silent conclusion appears, the one so many people make. I think too much. My mind never stops. I have overthinking. But there is an important question that almost never appears. What if your mind is not thinking too much, but doing exactly what it was trained to do? Because thinking is not just a random function of the brain. Thinking is a strategy, a way of trying to understand the world, to predict consequences, to avoid mistakes. Throughout much of life, many people learn something very specific, that anticipating is useful, that reviewing is intelligent, that analyzing deeply prevents problems. Maybe this started early. Maybe you learned that you needed to think before acting, that you needed to evaluate all possibilities, that you needed to anticipate reactions. In some environments, this becomes a valuable skill: observing, interpreting, anticipating, predicting. These skills can help someone avoid conflicts, make careful decisions, notice details that other people ignore. The brain learns through repetition. Every time a strategy helps avoid a problem, the system records it. It understands, this works, so it repeats it, and repeats it, and repeats it. Over time, something interesting happens. What began as a skill becomes a pattern, an automatic pattern. The brain no longer asks whether it needs to analyze so much. It simply does it, like software running in the background, looking for variables, testing scenarios, exploring possibilities. This explains why overthinking often does not feel like a choice. You do not decide to start analyzing everything. The mind simply enters that mode. It begins reviewing situations, connecting dots, simulating consequences. Not necessarily because there is a real problem, but because this is the method the system learned to use to deal with the world. Imagine someone who spent years working as an analyst. Every day this person has to observe data, find patterns, identify risks. After doing this for a long time, the brain gets used to it. It continues analyzing even outside of work, because that mode of functioning has become natural. Something similar can happen with the human mind. When the brain learns that analyzing deeply helps maintain control over situations, it keeps analyzing, even when it is not necessary, even when the moment calls for rest, even when there is nothing real to solve. And perhaps that is why overthinking feels so persistent. Not because your mind is broken, but because it was trained to observe more, think more, anticipate more. And when a system spends years learning to function that way, it does not turn off automatically. This raises an interesting question. If overthinking can be a learned pattern, what happens when the brain begins to realize that not every situation requires so much analysis? There is something curious about the way the brain learns patterns. It does not differentiate very well between what was useful in a specific moment and what needs to continue being used all the time. If a strategy helped a few times, the system tends to keep it active, especially if that strategy was associated with a feeling of safety. Think of a simple situation. Imagine someone who, at certain moments in life, avoided problems precisely because they thought more than others. Maybe they noticed something that no one else did. Maybe they predicted a reaction. Maybe they analyzed a situation carefully and avoided a bad decision. For the brain, this is powerful evidence. It records that sequence very clearly. Thinking more, helped. Analyzing more, protected. Anticipating, prevented mistakes. And then the system learns something. It learns that thinking a lot can be a way to maintain control. The problem is that the human brain was designed to prioritize safety. When something helps avoid risk, the system tends to amplify that strategy. It prefers to exaggerate protection rather than risk ignoring an important signal. That is why many mental patterns intensify over time. The brain does not ask, "Is this still necessary?" It simply continues using the method it learned. So what began as a useful skill can become a constant process. The mind starts reviewing conversations, simulating possibilities, reorganizing decisions, testing scenarios, not because there is an immediate problem, but because the system believes that thinking more increases the chances of avoiding something negative. This mechanism is subtle, and it often goes unnoticed, because from inside the experience it feels like just thinking. But in reality, something happens before the thought. A kind of internal scanning. The brain searches for variables. It tries to identify possible consequences. It reviews small pieces of information trying to assemble a more complete picture. It is as if the system were always running small simulations. What if I had said something different? What if that happens tomorrow? What if that person interpreted it another way? These questions do not necessarily appear as clear questions. They appear as recurring thoughts, fragments of analysis, small mental revisions. And the more the brain practices this type of processing, the more automatic it becomes. Over time, the system enters this mode almost without noticing, not because there is a real danger, but because it learned that deep analysis can prevent problems. This explains why overthinking often appears in moments of silence. When the environment slows down, the system finds space to continue doing what it knows how to do best: analyze, review, anticipate. During the day, external stimuli guide attention. There are tasks, conversations, movement. But when the rhythm slows, the mind returns to the mode it learned. It looks for patterns, it tests scenarios, it tries to find something that might need adjustment. And often there is nothing real to solve, but the system does not know that yet. It simply continues operating, like a radar that keeps spinning even when the sky is clear. And this creates a curious feeling. You realize that you are thinking, even when you do not want to think. And this raises a new question. If overthinking is a pattern the brain learned over time, does that mean there is something wrong with the mind? Or does it simply mean the system is applying an old strategy in a moment when it is no longer necessary? There is a moment when understanding begins to change. For a long time, many people believe the problem is excessive thinking. They try to find ways to silence the mind. They try to stop the analyses. They try to interrupt the scenarios that keep appearing. But when you observe how the brain actually functions, something different emerges. The problem may not be thinking too much. The problem may be the way the brain learned to deal with uncertainty. For the human brain, uncertainty has always represented risk. For thousands of years, not fully understanding a situation could mean danger. So the system developed a very specific strategy. When something is not completely clear, it thinks more. It reviews more. It tries to complete the missing information. This mechanism was extremely useful during much of human history. But in the modern world, many of the situations we face do not require this level of analysis. A social conversation, a message that was sent, a small, everyday decision. These situations do not represent real threat, but the brain does not always differentiate well. If there is any ambiguity, any doubt, any small possibility of interpretation, the system enters analysis mode. It tries to resolve what seems undefined. And this is where the cycle of overthinking begins. The brain tries to find a perfect conclusion, a complete answer, a definitive interpretation. But some human experiences simply do not offer that kind of answer. Conversations cannot be completely controlled. People's reactions cannot be predicted with precision. The future cannot be fully calculated, so the brain keeps trying. It reviews the same situation several times, not because it is broken, but because it is trying to solve something that may not have a perfect solution. Imagine a computer trying to finish an impossible calculation. It keeps processing, repeating operations, searching for a result that never arrives. Something similar happens with the mind. When the system believes it must find an absolute conclusion, it keeps running. Thoughts appear, hypotheses emerge, scenarios multiply, and the more the brain tries to solve, the more material it produces. This explains why overthinking often feels like a labyrinth. Each attempt to understand more deeply opens new possibilities, new questions, new interpretations, and without realizing it, the system enters a cycle. And when this cycle continues for a long time, the body begins to feel the silent effort of this constant analysis. Sometimes it's tension in the muscles, mental exhaustion, or difficulty truly resting. Thinking to solve, but the thinking produces more variables. More variables generate more analysis. More analysis generates more thinking. The curious thing is that this cycle rarely begins as a problem. It begins as an attempt to solve something, to understand better, to ensure that everything is under control. But when the brain applies this method to situations that do not require so much analysis, the process continues even when there is nothing left to solve. And perhaps this is where the perspective shifts more deeply. Maybe overthinking is not exactly too much thinking. Maybe it is a system that continues trying to find definitive answers in situations that do not require perfect answers. This completely changes the way we look at the mind, because it means the brain is not sabotaging you. It is simply trying to finish a calculation that never actually needs to be completed. And this raises an important question. If overthinking is the result of a system trying to resolve uncertainties, what happens when the brain begins to realize that not every uncertainty needs to be resolved? Perhaps the most important change happens when something simple begins to become clear. Thinking is not the problem. Thinking is an extraordinary ability of the human brain. It allows us to learn, plan, create, solve real problems. Thought itself was never the enemy. What often creates suffering is the silent expectation that every thought must lead to a conclusion, as if the mind were obligated to resolve every scenario that appears. But when you observe more closely, you notice something curious. Many thoughts are not questions that require answers. They are simply movements of the mind, quick simulations, fragments of memory, small attempts by the brain to organize experiences. And when the system believes that each of these thoughts must be solved, it enters a continuous cycle of analysis. But when that expectation begins to change, something different can happen. Thought continues to arise. That does not disappear, but it stops looking like a problem that must be solved immediately. It becomes simply thought, something that appears, remains for a moment, and then dissolves, just like a distant sound, just like a cloud passing across the sky. The brain may continue producing scenarios. It may continue reviewing some situations, but the sense of urgency can begin to decrease, because the system no longer needs to find a final answer for everything. This does not mean abandoning the ability to reflect. It does not mean stopping thinking when something truly requires attention. It simply means realizing that not every movement of the mind requires involvement. Some thoughts can simply pass, and when the system begins to notice this repeatedly, something curious happens. The rhythm of the mind itself may begin to change. Not because someone turned off a switch, but because the brain stops treating every thought as an unfinished task. The radar still exists, but it no longer needs to spin with the same intensity. Interestingly, many people report a specific moment when this shift begins to appear. They notice a thought arising, something that previously would have triggered a long analysis, but this time, something is different. The thought appears and simply continues on its way, without revision, without deep investigation, without the need to resolve everything. And in that moment, a quiet realization appears. Maybe the brain never needed to analyze as much as it seemed. Maybe it simply learned to use that strategy for a very long time. And maybe overthinking was never a defect of the mind. Maybe it was simply a system that became accustomed to searching for answers, even when no answer was actually necessary. This completely changes the way you look at your own mind. Because the question stops being, how do I stop thinking so much, and becomes something far more interesting. If the brain learned throughout life that thinking more helps resolve uncertainty, what happens when it begins to realize that some uncertainties simply do not need to be resolved?